Chapter 12, Part 1 of History of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, by James Ford Rhodes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 12, Part 1. Conditions in the Southern Confederacy were novel in that the community was cut off by the blockade from any extensive intercourse with the outer world. As the North was the stronger naval power, the blockade was clearly obvious, and was proclaimed by the President 1 week after the firing on Sumter. Although at first not thorough, it gradually increased in efficiency and proved one of the important agencies in deciding the war. But Lincoln and Grant saw plainly that peace could not be had until the Southern armies had been fought to a finish of destruction or surrender. To this end, the patient work of the Navy in blockading the Southern ports was a grateful and necessary aid to Grant and Sherman in their decisive operations. But the blockade of itself might have been maintained even unto the crack of doom if Lee's and Johnston's armies remained intact, living in a fertile country cultivated by a mass of negro non-combatants, clothed from an excess supply of cotton and a limited supply of wool. The relation between our army and navy during the Civil War was the same as between the British army and navy in 1914, when the English fleet had effectually blockaded the German ports and kept the German fleet in a safe harbor. Said the London Times, "The navy is our shield, the army our sword." The blockade was a source of acute discomfort to the Southern people, cutting them off from most luxuries and many necessaries. Salt, coffee, tea, soap, candles, matches, glue, advanced enormously in price and were extremely scarce. The blockade taught lessons of economy, causing highly bred young women of Charleston to dress in homespun, and Richmond gentlemen to wear last year's clothes. Brooms, chairs, baskets, brushes, pails, tubs, kegs, slate pencils, and knitting needles were scarce. Ink began to be made in the home by a crude process. In the news columns of the Charleston Courier, it was announced that a man in Caswell County, North Carolina, was manufacturing writing ink, which he would furnish in any quantity to those who would provide their own bottles. A Richmond apothecary advertised that he could not fill prescriptions unless persons requiring medicines should bring their own phials. But many common medicines were hard to get. The medical purveyor at Richmond appealed to the ladies of Virginia to cultivate the poppy so that opium might be had for the sick and wounded of the army. Various things were popularly suggested to take the place of quinine and other medicines. The Surgeon General sent out officially a formula for a compound tincture of dried dogwood, poplar and willow bark, and whiskey, to be issued as a tonic and febrifuge and substitute as far as practicable for quinine. Quinine and morphia were articles greatly desired in the trade with the North. All possible means were used to obtain these and other drugs, and a large amount of smuggling was at one time carried on from Cincinnati by men and women devoted to the Confederate cause. In October, 1862, when General Sherman was in command at Memphis, an imposing funeral headed by a handsome city hearse, with pall and plumes, was allowed by the guards to pass through the Union lines. The coffin which was borne by the hearse contained a lot of well-selected medicines for the Confederate army. A large doll filled with quinine was brought through the lines in a trunk from New Orleans. When it was scrutinized, the owner declared with tears in her eyes that the doll was for a poor crippled girl. This ruse was likewise successful in passing it through without the discovery of its precious burden. No deprivation was felt so keenly as the lack of tea and coffee. "Tea is beyond the reach of all save the most opulent," said the Charleston Courier in April, 1862. "I have not tasted coffee or tea for more than a year," is an entry of Jones on February 4, 1864. Rich people even abstained from the use of tea in order that the small supply should be saved for those who were ill. The hospitals procured coffee for a while, but on December 2, 1863, the Surgeon General ordered its discontinuance as an article of diet for the sick. "In consequence of the very limited supply," he added, "it is essential that it be used solely for its medicinal effect as a stimulant." People resorted to all kinds of substitutes. Parched rye, wheat, corn, sweet potatoes, chestnuts, peanuts, chicory and cottonseed took the place of the Arabian berry, but all agreed that there was nothing coffee but coffee. For tea, a decoction of dried currant, blackberry and sage leaves, of sassafras root or blossoms was drunk, and some tried to make themselves believe that the substitute was as good as China tea. Fremantle, during his travels through the South, tasted no tea from April 6 to June 17, 1863, when some uncommonly good was offered him at President Davis's house. In 1862 may be noted a scarcity of salt and anxiety as to a future supply, especially for the army, as salt meat was a large part of the army ration. The governor of Mississippi wrote to Davis that "the destitution of salt is alarming," and the governor of Alabama, in a letter to the Secretary of War, said, "The salt famine in our land is most lamentable." The earthen floors of smoke houses, saturated by the dripping of bacon, were dug up and boiled, that no salty material be left unused. Sea water was to a large extent utilized to provide for the deficiency, but a more valuable source of supply was the saline springs of southwestern Virginia. The Commonwealth of Virginia embarked on the manufacture of salt, and made regulations for its distribution to the public. Other states followed her example, so that the salt famine was to some extent mitigated. Another serious hardship arose from the scarcity of paper. Many of the newspapers were gradually reduced in size, and were finally printed on half sheets. Sometimes one sheet would be brown, another wall paper. Even the white paper was frequently coarse; and this, together with the inferior type, made the news sheet itself a daily record of the waning material fortunes of the Confederacy. The Richmond Examiner said that the editorials of the journals were written on brown paper, waste paper, backs of old letters and rejected essays, unpaid bills, bits of foolscap torn from the copy books of youth and the ledgers of the business men. An Alabama editor used a shingle; when one editorial was set up, he would wipe it out and write another. Another editor employed in a similar way his schoolboy slate. An advertisement in the Charleston Courier ran that no more orders for Miller's Almanac for 1863 could be filled, unless 40 or 50 reams of printing paper could be purchased. Mrs. McGuire could not get a blank book in which to continue her diary, and was obliged to use wrapping paper for the vivid account of her daily experiences. Mrs. Putnam states that their family and friendly letters were written on paper which they would hardly have used for wrapping paper before the war. Envelopes which had been received were frequently turned inside out and used for the reply. Curry relates that the tax receipts given for the produce of his farm in Alabama were written on brown paper and had a dingy, archaic appearance. Citizens, as a boon to the press and the public, nay, the government itself, were urged to send their accumulated rags to the paper manufacturers. There was danger of an iron famine, and certain other metals were in short supply. Information came to the Charleston arsenal that many patriotic citizens were willing to contribute their lead window weights to the government for war purposes, and the captain of the corps of artillery in charge offered to replace them with iron. The editor of the Charleston Courier offered the lead water pipe in his residence, as a free gift to my beloved and imperiled country. Other similar offers were made, and church bells were proffered that their metal might be melted and cast into cannon. Contemporary writings are full of complaints of lack of bread and meat. Hunger, wrote Professor Gildersleeve, was the dominant note of life in the Confederacy. While this was true of Virginia, which largely had Lee's army to feed and suffered from the devastation of the Northern armies, the rest of the Confederacy was, on the whole, pretty well supplied with food, although there was suffering from the short crop of cereals of 1862 in many states owing to a severe drought. But if the railroads had been in shape to do their proper work of distribution, all parts of the Confederacy would have been well supplied. During this year of 1862, Texas had a large crop of grain, and was able to supply contiguous parts of the Confederacy with grain, beef, and mutton, but next year such commerce would have been stopped by Grant's capture of Vicksburg and possession of the Mississippi River. While Virginia complained of scarcity, Sherman in January, 1863, reported abundant supplies in Mississippi. "We found cattle and fat ones feeding quietly," he wrote. "The country everywhere abounds with corn." Grant's cutting loose from his base in May, 1863, and living upon the country is a well known episode; and during the autumn of 1864, Sherman's army in Georgia reveled in plenty, while Lee's soldiers almost starved in Virginia. The whole difficulty was one of transportation. In 1861 the railroads began to deteriorate, and as the years went on their condition got worse and worse. The wear and tear of a railroad is enormous, and can be counteracted only by constant repair and renewal, which in this case was impossible. In time of peace every article of railroad equipment had been purchased at the North. While freight cars were constructed at the South, Every bolt and rod, every wheel and axle, every nail, spike and screw, every sheet of tin, every ounce of solder, every gallon of oil and every pound of paint, came from the northern workshops and factories, as did likewise, for the most part, passenger cars and locomotives. If these last were sometimes made at the South, this concession to local patriotism or convenience cost much in money. At the same time with decay came increased business, one element in which was the transportation of food to great distances for the army and cities. In 1862, a good crop of Indian corn in southern Georgia and Florida, and the poor one elsewhere east of Louisiana, required equalization, which the railroads were called upon to effect. They hauled a considerable amount of provisions and other freight, but in 1862 and the succeeding years, were utterly unable to satisfy the demands of the government and the public. In April, 1863, there were 6,300 miles of railroad in the Confederacy, exclusive of those in the hands of the enemy, which was enough considering that they were conveniently located to handle the government traffic and serve the public to some extent, if they could be used to the full. But, owing to the deterioration of the permanent way and lack of equipment, few trains were run, and as compared with northern practice at the same period, the train load was light. From everywhere came complaints. Cities wanted food which the railroads could not bring. In January, 1864, it was said that Indian corn was selling at $1 and $2 a bushel in southwestern Georgia, and at $12 or $15 in Virginia. Another Richmond authority, at the close of that year, was sure that everyone would have enough to eat if food could be properly distributed. The possession of the railroads by the northern armies as they advanced interfered with proper transportation. This is exemplified by a comparison of the railroad guides in 1863 and 1864. Under the head of certain railroads, instead of the timetable, one may read, "The Yankees have possession of a portion of this road at present," or "The entire road is in the hands of the Yankees." These indications were more numerous in 1864 than in 1863. Government work continually encroached on the ordinary business of the railroads, yet this was by no means well done. The public suffered as well as the army. Mails were irregular and long delayed. Newspapers failed to be received, or, when they came to hand, were many days old. The traveler on the railroad encountered difficulties and dangers, of which the two railroad guides published at the South gave no inkling. Consulting these, he might have expected in 1863 to make his journey at the rate of from 14 to 18 miles per hour, including stops, and in 1864 at a rate not greatly less. But the indications of the guides were deceptive. The traveler was lucky if his train made a continued progress of from 5 to 8 miles per hour. Trains were always late and connections were missed. Frequent accidents, many of which were fatal, happened because of the unstable condition of the permanent way and equipment. General Joseph E. Johnston, on his way to Richmond to Chattanooga in November, 1862, to take command of the new department assigned to him, was delayed by several railroad accidents. Freemantle gave a good humored account of his experiences in June, 1863, between Charleston and Richmond. At Florence he was detained by the breakdown of another train, and when his own was at last ready he fought his way into some desperately crowded cars. After being transferred by boat at Wilmington, he had a hot and an oppressive all day's ride in a dreadfully crowded train. "We changed cars at Weldon," he wrote, "where I had a terrific fight for a seat, but I succeeded, for experience had made me very quick at this sort of business." Traveling as continuously as possible, he was 41 hours from Charleston to Richmond, a journey which is now made in 10. Another Englishman mentions the conventional joke that "a journey from Wilmington to Richmond was almost as dangerous as an engagement with the enemy." According to the official estimate of the capacity and the schedules, 1 or 2 passenger trains ran daily each way on the railroads, but at times the government compelled the suspension of all other service in favor of the transportation of provisions for the army, and of officers and soldiers returning to their commands. In April, 1864, a certain minister was unable to keep his engagement to preach a sermon at the opening session of the Presbyterian anniversary at Augusta, as, by reason of the military necessity, ordinary travel on all railroads between that city and Richmond had been prohibited. Vice President Stevens gave an interesting relation of his attempted journey in May, 1864, from his Georgia home to the capital of the Confederacy, when he traveled northward from Charlotte, in a passenger car attached to a train loaded with bacon for the army. On one dark and rainy night he ascertained that there was a train 5 minutes behind his, and that the only precaution taken against a rear-end collision was the placing of a lamp on the rear platform of his car. The locomotive steamed slowly up the grades, but dashed furiously downhill. While going up a steep grade, the cars broke loose from the locomotive and ran down the grade at increasing speed for 2 miles until, having reached the foot of one hill, they began to ascend the other and finally came to a stop just in time to avoid colliding with the train behind. After a while the locomotive came back and Stevens proceeded on his journey. Stopped at Danville by a fatal accident ahead of him, and learning that the railroad had been cut by the enemy between Danville and Richmond, he believed that it would be almost impossible to reach the capital and therefore decided to return home. Suffering unaccountable delays, he traveled a part of the way on a train bearing a large number of "Yankee prisoners" and wounded Confederates from the battles of the Wilderness. He had one seat reserved for him in the single passenger car. The rest of the train was made up of box cars, which the Yankees filled inside and out, they being given the preference in dispatch to the Confederates, who in their wrath swore that "the Yankees ought to be killed." But instead of that they were cared more for than the men who had been wounded in defending their country. In September, 1864, Thomas Dabney wrote from Macon that in Middle Georgia the railroads were in the hands of the government, and all private travel was excluded except on freight trains. As a special favor Governor Brown's wife was given passage in an express car, a close box. Dabney himself, desiring to take his family, servants, and furniture from Macon to Jackson, Mississippi, chartered 2 box cars for several $1,000s, and they traveled thither on freight trains, stopping at night and not infrequently a whole day, consuming 2 weeks on a journey which with close connections could now be made in less than 20 hours. For this defective transportation, from which the government and public suffered, all sorts of remedies were suggested by government officials and railroad presidents and superintendents, but most of them involved a development of manufacturing industries or an extension of commerce which was impossible. Lack of iron was the serious difficulty. If an adequate supply of this metal had been available, the railroads could have been kept in repair. How scarce it was is implied in the request that the government impress the rails of an unprofitable railroad and give them to another company for the extension of its line. Indeed, such an expedient was afterwards resorted to. Army officers likewise frequently impressed cars and locomotives and ordered the rolling stock from one road to another without providing for its return. But on the other hand, the government made appropriations of money for the completion of certain lines of railroads. A study of conditions in the South cannot fail to emphasize the dependence of modern civilization on iron. It will also cause surprise that practically nothing had been done to utilize the rich deposits of iron ore and the abundance of coking coal in many of the Southern states. Everywhere is one struck with a painful scarcity of iron. In a paper read before a railroad conference in Richmond, it was suggested that the government make a public appeal for all the cast and wrought iron scrap on the farms, in the yards and houses of citizens of the Confederacy, and that it establish a system for the collection from the country, cities, towns, and villages, of broken or worn out plows, plow points, hoes, spades, axes, broken stoves, household and kitchen utensils, with promise of adequate compensation. The rails of the street railroad in Richmond were taken up to be made into armor for a gunboat. The planters of Alabama in those very regions where iron ore in abundance existed underground could not get iron enough to make and repair their agricultural implements. The Charleston Courier complained that a sword could not be made in the Confederacy. A remark of a Union officer after the capture of Vicksburg offended the Confederate who reports it, yet it contains a pertinent criticism of a one-sided material development. The officer, noting on the iron stairway of the Vicksburg courthouse the name of a Cincinnati manufacturer molded on it, exclaimed, "Confound the impudence of the people who thought they could whip the United States, when they couldn't even make their own staircases." The war demand stimulated the manufacture of iron in the Confederacy; but a comparison of the iron industry at the South with that at the North under the same stimulus shows rude and early methods contrasted with a practice which, though wasteful and untechnical beside the European, did nevertheless meet the exigency of the moment, and become the parent of the preeminently scientific and practical processes of the present day. The iron blast furnaces at the South were small and of antiquated construction. The fuel used was charcoal, no attempt having been made apparently to smelt the ores with coke or raw coal. In the oldest iron region, Virginia, The constant cutting of timber for a series of years had made it alarmingly scarce. Ore existed in pockets which were soon worked out, and many furnaces had but a precarious supply of it which was hauled to them for miles in wagons, in one case as far as 10 miles. If ore was plenty, fuel was likely to be scarce, or else the converse was the case. Even if both were at hand in sufficient quantity to make 10 tons daily, which was considered a large product, it was impossible to feed the hands necessarily employed, who must depend on the immediate neighborhood for supplies of bread and meat, since transportation of these from a distance was out of the question. In Alabama the industry made a better showing. It was a new region. Fuel and ore were abundant, and food could be had. Of the large and improved furnaces, one owned by the government made an average of 13 tons daily for a month. Georgia and Tennessee were the other iron manufacturing states, and in all of them the work was obstructed by the steady progress of the Union armies in the occupation of Southern territory. Within the year ending October 1, 1864, 10 iron furnaces in Virginia, all but 3 in Tennessee, all in Georgia, and 4 in Alabama had been burned by the enemy, or abandoned because of his inroads. Yet in a report of November 20, 1864, it was stated that 18 furnaces were in blast in Virginia, although their work was very irregular. In return for certain privileges and assistance, the government took one half of the production of iron at a little above cost, and had for the remaining half the preference over other purchasers. The amount of iron reported as received by the Niter and Mining Bureau is surprisingly small, and the figures cannot adequately measure the production, which nevertheless, by a liberal estimate, must have been insignificant as compared with that of the North. Despite the unfavorable conditions under which they labored, the Confederates did not lack munitions of war. Through home manufacture and imports by blockade runners, they always had a sufficient supply of small arms and ordnance. The small arms came chiefly from abroad. The field, siege, and seacoast artillery were produced mainly in the arsenals and workshops of the Confederacy. Their rifles were equal in efficiency to those used by the Union soldiers, and breech-loading carbines were made in Richmond for the cavalry. During the last 2 years of the war, the Northern artillery may have been superior to the Southern. In 1861 and 1862, the Confederates captured many arms from their enemy, but in 1863 the conditions were reversed, and they lost at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Port Hudson 75,000 stand of small arms, and in addition a considerable amount of ordnance. England and France desired the cotton and tobacco which glutted the Southern markets, whilst the South needed the arms, munitions of war, and iron which England could furnish in abundance. This desirable exchange was prevented by the blockade. Hence it became necessary to resort to blockade running, an enterprise which attracted capital by reason of its enormous profits when successful. This trade in 1861 was of an improvised character, and was carried on by Southern coasting steamers whose regular business was gone, and by small craft which, though slow, had little difficulty at first in evading the blockade and reaching some nearby neutral port. Vessels laden with arms, munitions of war, and merchandise cleared from Great Britain for some port in the West Indies, but their true destination was the Southern Confederacy, and when their voyage was successful they brought back cargoes of the Southern staples. As adventurous business men in England and in the Confederacy became accustomed to the state of war, and had constantly before their eyes the high price and scarcity of cotton in England, and the low price and plenty in the Confederacy, with certain necessaries of war and articles of comfort in the reverse order, they discerned in these conditions a rare opportunity for profitable trade. Meanwhile the blockade was becoming steadily more stringent, and the business of evading it grew from the haphazard methods of its earlier days into a regular system. Arms, munitions of war, blankets, army cloth, shoes, tea, soap, letter paper and envelopes, fine fabrics of cotton, linen, wool, and silk, cases and barrels of medicines, liquors, wines, and other merchandise were shipped from England to Bermuda, Nassau, or Havana, and there transferred to blockade runners, which made their way to Wilmington, Charleston, Savannah, Mobile, or Galveston. If these ports were soon reached, a quick and lucrative market was found for the cargo; and a return load of cotton, or occasionally tobacco or turpentine, was brought to Nassau, Bermuda, or Havana, and there transshipped to the vessel which carried them to England. The blockade runners were now specially constructed for their trade, and a typical one of 1863 1864 was a low, long, narrow, swift, side wheel steamer, with light draught and a capacity of 400 to 600 tons. The hull was painted a dull gray or lead color, which rendered the vessel invisible, unless at short range, even in daylight. In order to avoid smoke, Pennsylvania anthracite was used when it could be had, otherwise Welsh semi-bituminous coal. Nassau was the most important neutral, and Charleston and Wilmington the most important Confederate ports in this trade. The blockade runner left Nassau at an hour that would bring her off Charleston or Wilmington at night, and the running of the blockade was rarely attempted unless there was no moon. When near the blockading squadron, all lights were put out, the engine room hatchways and binnacle were covered with tarpaulin, and the steamer made her way forward in utter darkness. No noise was permitted. Necessary orders and reports of soundings were given in muffled voices. Steam was blown off under water. Often the blockade runners escaped without being seen. Sometimes they were chased, but escaped; sometimes the pursuit was so hard that they ran ashore or were captured. It was a keenly contested game between these and the blockaders, only to be played by those loving the sea. The tales of the blockade runners are highly interesting, full as they are of the spice of adventure. Battling with the sea in overloaded craft specially constructed to avoid other danger; feeling their way through the blockading squadron; now painfully making their port without regularly set lights; now detected, pursued, and resorting to all manner of tricks to elude the pursuers; loving fog, darkness, and mystery. They were cool, fearless, nervy men, and their stories are highly romantic. Less thrilling the tale of the blockader. The blockade runner chose his own time and had the excitement of the attempt; but the blockader must be ever vigilant throughout long periods of inaction. After days and nights of anxious watching, the emergency lasting brief minutes might come when least expected. The great extent of coast, much of it having a double line with numerous inlets, and the necessity for the blockading ships to ride out the gales at anchor, close to a hostile shore, made of this blockade an operation that for difficulty was probably without precedent. It was certainly the first time that the evaders of a blockade had the powerful help of steam. The eager desire to obtain cotton was another factor operating to the advantage of the blockade runners, as was likewise the proximity of friendly neutral ports. The effective work of the United States Navy is measured by the number of captures and by the increasing difficulty of evading the blockade. Gradually, port after port was practically closed until none were left but Charleston and Wilmington. Wilmington, owing to the peculiar configuration and character of the coast, and the large island at the entrance of Cape Fear River, was the most difficult port of all to blockade, and in 1863 and 1864 its trade with Nassau and Bermuda was large. On June 16, 1863, Fremantle, passing through Wilmington, counted 8 large steamers, all handsome leaden colored vessels, which ply their trade with the greatest regularity. Blockade running to and from port continued until the taking of Fort Fisher, in January, 1865, but the risk of capture during the last 6 months of activity was great. Charleston remained open until Sherman's northward march compelled its evacuation, but for a long while before this only the best constructed steamers could run the blockade, and the success even of these was rare. The work of the United States Navy in the blockade was an affair of long patience unrelieved by the prospect of brilliant exploits. Lacking the stimulus of open battle, it required discipline and character only the more. But the reward to the country was great, for the blockade played an important part in the final outcome of the war. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. Chapter 12, Part 2 of History of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, by James Ford Rhodes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 12, Part 2. The cotton crops were made by the negro slaves, and one of the strange things in this eventful history is the peaceful labor of 3½ million negro slaves, whose presence in the South was the cause of the war and whose freedom was fought for after September, 1862, by the Northern soldiers. The evidence warrants the oft-repeated statement that the blacks made no move to rise. 1,000 torches, Henry Grady declared, would have disbanded the Southern army, but there was not one. Instead of rising, they remained patiently submissive and faithful to their owners. It was their labor that produced food for the soldiers fighting to keep them in slavery, and without them the cotton could not have been grown, which brought supplies from Europe and the North. "Our great strength," declared a Confederate army staff officer, "consists in our system of slave labor because it makes our 8,000,000 productive of fighting material equal to the 20,000,000 of the North." One owner or overseer to every 20 slaves was exempt from military service in order to secure the proper police of the country; but a study of the conditions indicates that these were needed not as a restraining influence, but for the purposes of intelligent direction. As a matter of fact, the able bodied negroes remained on the plantation of the sparsely settled country of the Confederacy, while, with few exceptions, the white people in the neighborhood were old or diseased men, women, and children. Here is a remarkable picture, and one that discovers virtues in the Southern negroes and merit in the civilization under which they had been trained. The slaves came to know of Lincoln's proclamation of emancipation, and had a vague idea that the success of the Northern arms would set them free. As the Union armies penetrated into the country, negroes in great number, who had fanciful ideas of what freedom meant, followed them, often to the manifest inconvenience of the commanders. The slaves were friendly to the Union soldiers whom they encountered; they fed any who escaped from Southern prisons, and, by handing them on from one to another, guided them to the Federal lines. At the same time they would conceal the valuables of their mistresses, lest they should be stolen by the camp followers and stragglers of the Union army, showing some craft in keeping the hiding places secret. Thus they maintained a divided allegiance. Many Confederate officers were saved from death or capture by the care and devotion of their body servants, while other negroes served as guides to Union generals when important offensive movements were on foot. The South came to conscription sooner than the North. An act of April 16, 1862, prompted by the Southern reverses, chief of which was the capture of Fort Donelson, placed in the military service all white men between the ages of 18 and 35. An act of September 27th of the same year extended the conscription to all white men between 35 and 45; but at first only those of 40 or under were enrolled, but directly after Gettysburg and Vicksburg, President Davis ordered that all between 40 and 45 should be included in the enrollment. On February 17, 1864, the Confederate Congress passed an act requiring that all white men between 17 and 50 should be in the military service. "They have robbed the cradle and the grave," said Grant. As men became weary of the war, desertion was more common. Compulsory service was disliked and evaded by many whenever possible. Homesickness and the wretched fare in the army were prolific causes of this abandonment of duty. Gettysburg and Vicksburg were potent arguments with the Southern people. "Dear Seddon," wrote a friend from Mobile, "we are without doubt gone up." Soldiers deserted by the hundreds; even whole regiments left at a time. Deserters almost always carried their muskets, and when halted and asked for their authority to be absent from the army, would pat their guns and say defiantly, "This is my furlough." In the mountain fastnesses of South Carolina, bold and defiant deserters were banded together. With traveling and threshing machines they worked their farms in common, and congregated at still yards and houses, where they distilled quantities of liquor and swore vengeance on any one who should attempt their arrest. Summing up the mass of evidence which came to the War Department, Judge Campbell wrote: "The condition of things in the mountain districts of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Alabama, menaces the existence of the Confederacy as fatally as either of the armies of the United States." The much rarer references to desertion in the official papers of 1864, the somewhat satisfied tone of Seddon's report of April 28th of that year, the full ranks of Lee's and Johnston's armies, and their heroic resistance, are evidence that, through the influence of public sentiment and the persistently rigorous measures of the government, the evil of desertion had by that time been greatly mitigated. The military operations of the autumn of 1864, however, resulted in disaster to the Confederates, whilst Lincoln's reelection amounted to a notification that there would be no cessation of the vigorous onward movement of the Northern armies. A weighty recommendation that conscription be given up, and volunteering resorted to again to recruit the army, and the fact that there were 100,000 deserters, are not reasons for condemning the Confederate policy of conscription, but they are among the many indications that the Southern cause was lost. The Confederacy was practically supported, in so far as its strictly defined financial operations were concerned, By the issue of paper money and from the proceeds of bonds which were paid for in the paper currency. In this medium the holders of the bonds received their interest. Owing to the stringency of the blockade, the revenue derived from the export duty on cotton and from duties on imports was inconsiderable. No large amount of money was raised by internal taxation. An attempt to maintain specie payments would have been futile. $27,000,000 is an outside estimate of the receipts in specie of the Confederate government during its life of 4 years. Before the end of 1863, $700,000,000 of Treasury notes were in circulation, and this amount was increased during the next year to $1,000,000,000, but the issues grow so enormously that apparently no exact amount of them was made public. It is even possible that the Treasury Department itself did not know the amount afloat. But this was not the extent of the inflation of the currency. The different states issued state treasury notes. The banks expanded their circulation. Richmond, Charleston, and other cities put out municipal treasury bills. Railroad, turnpike, and insurance companies, factories, and savings banks added to the mass paper of money. A large part of this municipal and corporation paper was issued in denominations below $1 to supply the need for small change caused by the disappearance of fractional silver. In North Carolina, 10-penny nails passed current at 5 cents apiece. At times, postage stamps circulated. Tobacconists, grocers, barkeepers, and milk dealers put out shin plasters. In 1862, the Confederate government began the issue of $1 and $2 bills and of fractional amounts under $1. It was a carnival of fiat money. Early in 1864, it was conceded that something must be done to contract the currency. The financial history of the American Revolution and the French Revolution repeated itself on February 17th of that year, in a measure of virtual repudiation. This was a provision for the compulsory funding of the notes into 4% bonds. If the bonds were not taken, all notes of the denominations under $100 might be exchanged for new ones in the ratio of $3 of old money for $2 of the new. If neither exchange was made, the old notes were to be taxed out of existence. This was really a confession of bankruptcy by the Confederate Congress and the President. The financial situation was hopeless unless independence could be won. The people of the South recognized the superior resources of the North by accepting readily in trade United States greenbacks. They were quoted in Richmond and might be seen in the brokers' offices. Another symptom of the debasement of the Confederate currency was the resort to barter. Manufacturers and merchants advertised in the newspapers, offering their goods in exchange for farm and other products. To obtain supplies for the army, wrote Seddon to Lee on March 29, 1864, "We must not recur to the most expensive and mischievous of all modes, the issue of a redundant currency. I expect to introduce and to rely upon to a considerable extent a system of barter." Accompanying the redundant currency were apparent high prices. Contemporary and later writings are full of the subject, and indicate the impression made on people's minds by the advance of daily comforts and conveniences. Mrs. Jefferson Davis, drawing from her own domestic experiences and from private diaries, has presented many of the facts in an interesting manner. In July, 1862, when gold was worth $1.50, beef and mutton sold in Richmond for 37½ cents a pound, potatoes $6 a bushel, tea $5 a pound, and boots $25 per pair. In the early part of 1864, when $1 in gold brought $22 in Confederate money, she reports the price of a turkey as $60, flour $300 per barrel, and in July of that year shoes $150 per pair. Gold increased steadily in value, and most articles of consumption followed until the extravagant prices were reached which prevailed in the last days of the Confederacy. That money was cheap rather than articles of food dear is signified by the experiences of two Englishmen. Lieutenant Colonel Freemantle was in Charleston during June, 1863, and wrote that the fare was good at the Charleston hotel, the charge being $8 a day, which was equivalent to but little over $1 in gold. A compatriot sojourning at the best hotel in Richmond in January, 1864, remarked that he had never lived so cheaply in any country. It is true that he paid $20 per day, but that was equal to only 3 shillings of his own money. The great concern of the Confederate government was to feed the army, and when its financial system broke down, it resorted to the tax of 1/10 in kind of agricultural products, and collected this tax by the impressment of food (1863). The impossibility of supplying the army by purchase alone being now clearly recognized, the act of impressment inaugurated a far-reaching system of taking private property for public use, and authorized substantially, within certain limits, any officer of the army to seize any property anywhere in the Confederacy, in order to accumulate supplies, or for the good of the service. The outcry against the operation of this law was bitter, widely extended, and prolonged; and the evils of impressment were thoroughly appreciated by the War Department. Some attempt, which was probably futile, was made to correct the abuses. Its operation was conceded to be harsh, unequal, and odious, but inexorable necessity had led to the adoption of the policy and would require its continuance. High taxation, loans, and the purchase of food at the market price was suggested as a policy in lieu of impressment. All had become impracticable. In 1863, the currency in which the taxes were received was redundant and steadily depreciating. In 1864 it was scarce, but worth still less than in 1863. All sorts of bond issues were tried, and as large an amount of loans was floated as the market would take. That the amount of bonds was smaller in proportion to the amount of Treasury notes than one would expect was not due to financial mismanagement, but to the paucity of savings available at the South for such a permanent investment. The surplus capital, as is well known, had been constantly laid out in land and negroes. By January 1st, 1863, it became apparent that primitive methods must supplant the modern mechanism of business operations. The South had practically no specie, or, in other words, no basis for a modern fiscal system, consisting of a redeemable currency and bonds. She had no credit. At the outbreak of the war she was in debt to the North and to Europe. With the closing of her ports by the blockade, her chance of getting any credits in the marts of the world was gone. One has only to look over many schedules of goods that went out and came in by the blockade runners to understand how insignificant was the exchange of commodities through this precarious commerce. The blockade running and the trade with the North brought in articles of prime necessity for carrying on the war, and all the cotton which went out was absorbed in these indispensable transactions. There was not enough of it to establish credits or bring in specie. The resort then to the tithe and to impressment was unavoidable. The tithe was, under the circumstances, an admirable method of taxation; and though it bore hard on the farmers, and was the cause of complaint, the bulk of the testimony is to the effect that it worked well. Like much of the other statecraft, both North and South, it was a policy too tardily adopted because of men's imperfect comprehension of the magnitude and duration of the struggle. It is now easy to see that it should have been imposed on the crop of 1862, which would have tended to make the latter impressment operations less onerous. In 1863 affairs were at a pitch where impressment became imperative. The law was not at fault, but its administration was defective. A consideration of the grievances it gave rise to will show how stringent law was rendered odious through negligence, lack of uniformity, and undue harshness in execution. The sparsely settled region of the South presented grave obstacles to the efficient operation of the plan. The methods which had served this simple agricultural community in time of peace no longer availed. A system of administration by trained officials was needed to handle the enormous amount of business brought on by the war; and in the ingenuity requisite to devise such a system, the South was far inferior to the North. Yet, though the South had no specie, no credits, and no commerce that was not seriously hampered, she had land and laborers; and in utilizing these in a somewhat imperfect fashion, she kept her armies and citizens from starvation, and maintained the struggle for 4 years. Richmond was near the seat of war, and after the battles, the wounded were brought to the city in such numbers as to demand unremitting labor to relieve their sufferings. In 1862 there were 35 public and private hospitals in Richmond, and churches were likewise converted into temporary abiding places for those who had been shot in the field. Devotion to the Southern cause beat high in the hearts of their womankind, compelling well-born and fastidious ladies to the care of men wounded in every distressful and revolting manner, and tormented by physical suffering which from lack of anesthetics and morphine the surgeons were often powerless to relieve. It was the case, we all know. When pain and anguish wring the brow, a ministering angel thou. But old as it is, there is always fresh inspiration in it to those who tell the tale of a cause they have embraced. Confederate writings are full of gratitude to the women. Their works in Richmond were matched everywhere throughout the Confederacy. Heavily as the war bore on Northern women, the distress of Southern women had a wider range. In the Union there were many families who had no near relative in the war. In the Confederacy it was a rare exception when neither husband, father, son, nor brother was in the army. Hardly a household was not in mourning. Moreover, the constant suspense affected a larger number than at the North. In Richmond, where intelligence of battles was received with comparative promptness, the frequent sounding of the tocsin indicating the proximity of danger increased the general disquietude, while those who lived in the country where newspapers were infrequent and mails irregular felt they would have preferred living in the midst of alarms to having their anxious uncertainty thus prolonged. Physical privations are far from alleviating moral distress, and the lack of luxuries and then of necessaries increased the harshness of women's lot in the Confederacy. The tale of poverty in its everyday aspect is familiar to us all, but at the South the contrast between life before the war and afterwards is most unusual and striking. In the domestic establishments plenty had been the rule, even lavishness. Tables groaned under the weight of food. The Southerners had been extravagant in their living and generous in their entertainment. Servants were numerous. Southern ladies who had never taken thought where food came from, who had themselves never stooped to the least physical exertion, were now forced by the advance of the enemy to leave their luxurious homes and take refuge in Richmond. There they might be seen in line before the cheapest shop awaiting their chance to spend the scant wages of "plain sewing" or copying or clerical work in a government office for a pittance of flour or bacon. No clerkship was given to a woman unless she would aver that she was in want, and in the Treasury Department one vacancy would elicit 100 applications, a number of which came from ladies of gentle birth and former affluence. Other ladies accustomed to luxury did the menial work of the household. Such labor was peculiarly distasteful to the Southern bred woman, yet this and the insufficiency of wholesome food were borne with cheerfulness in the hope of independence and the preservation of their social institutions. It seemed to them that the North had undertaken a crusade against the social fabric under which they and their mothers had been reared, and that the war which caused their sufferings had been forced upon the South, which was now defending her vested rights. The devastation of country, the wanton destruction in cities, the pillage conducted by the more disreputable Northern soldiers exasperated them to a point where they could no longer control their feelings, but gave vent to violent expression of indignation, some of which are recorded in the diaries of the period. "If all the words of hatred in every language," wrote a young Georgia woman, "were lumped together in one huge epithet of detestation, they could not tell how I hate Yankees." Fully as noticeable as at the North was the profound religious sentiment pervading soldiers and people. A preacher spoke of the active piety which prevailed in the army, and Seddon attested a large religious element and much devotional feeling. George Carey Eggleston related that in the last year of the war a revival took place among Lee's soldiers. Prayer meetings were held in every tent. Testaments were in every hand, and a sort of religious ecstasy took possession of the army. In the annals of the Episcopal Church an incident is recorded which serves pleasantly to relieve the general bitterness of the war. The bishops and clergy of the South appealed to their brethren at the North to send down 2,000 or 3,000 prayer books, and a quantity of church tracts for use in the Confederate army. The United States government gave permission for passing these through the lines of the Union army. In concluding this survey, a comparison between South and North with respect to certain prepossessions of the two peoples naturally suggests itself. The Confederate Congress refused a number of times to make their Treasury notes a legal tender, construing the clause of the Constitution, alike in the Confederate and Federal, which related to the subject, more strictly than did the United States Congress. In the thorough discussions that took place, it was mainly the constitutional arguments which prevented such legislation, although this was advocated by many men of influence, among them General Lee. In the practical application of the clause of the Constitution, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it, the Confederate government exhibited the greater regard for the liberty of the individual, and the Southern citizen the greater jealousy of the use of arbitrary power. Lincoln from the first assumed the right to suspend the writ by executive decree, a right never claimed by Davis. It was generally conceded at the South that Congress alone possessed this power, and the privilege was available to the citizens of the Confederacy except when curtailed by express statute. And the Confederate Congress asserted its rights boldly enough, declaring in the act of February 15, 1864, that "the power of suspending the privilege of said writ is vested solely in the Congress, which is the exclusive judge of the necessity of such suspension." The war may be said to have lasted 4 years. The periods of suspension of the writ in the Confederacy amounted in the aggregate to 1 year, 5 months, and 2 days, less than one half of the war's duration. In the Union the writ was suspended or disregarded at any time and in any place where the Executive, or those to whom he delegated this power, deemed such action necessary. For any one who in any manner or degree took an unfriendly attitude toward the recruitment of the army, for political prisoners, for persons suspected of any disloyal practice, the privilege did not exist. It was suspended for 1 year, 10 months, and 21 days by executive assumption, and for the rest of the period by the authorization of Congress. The provocation for the use of arbitrary power was, all things considered, about equal in the Confederacy and the Union. In the Union, the disloyal secret societies were larger and more dangerous, and the public criticism of the administration more copious and bitter. There was, too, the organized political party which made a focus for the opposition and developed Vallandigham, who had no counterpart at the South. But these considerations are balanced by the circumstance that in the South was the seat of war which was never, but for brief periods, moved north of Mason and Dixon's line and the Ohio River. "Civil administration is everywhere relaxed," wrote Judge Campbell as early as October, 1862, "and has lost much of its energy, and our entire Confederacy is like a city in a state of siege, cut off from all intercourse with foreign nations, and invaded by a superior force at every assailable point." Where armies stand in opposition, disloyalty may give the enemy aid and comfort so substantial as to decide an impending battle. Far from the front it is apt to spend itself in bluster, threats, and secret midnight oaths. In the Confederacy there was practically no important place east of the Mississippi River which was not at one time or another invaded or threatened by the invader. The courts, it is true, were open in the South, but owing to the disorganized state of society, the interruption of trade, and the passage of stay laws by the states, they tried few commercial cases, but confined themselves to criminal jurisdiction, and to decisions sustaining the acts of Congress; or on the other hand to issuing writs of habeas corpus in favor of those who desired to escape military service. The press was essentially free at the North, entirely so at the South, where no journals were suppressed as some had been in the Union. As the Southern papers had little news-gathering enterprise, and borrowed a large part of their news from the Northern press, they did not offend the Confederate generals as the Union generals were offended by the publication of estimates of the strength of armies or shrewd guesses of projected movements. Sometimes the Richmond journals, upon request of General Lee or of the Secretary of War, refrained from publishing intelligence that might benefit the enemy, but no compulsion was employed. The right of public meeting was fully exercised in both sections, but the gathering for free discussion were much more common at the North. Southerners believed that the Federal government had degenerated into a military despotism. At the same time, the general belief at the North was that the Confederate government was a tyranny which crushed all opposition. The basis for both these beliefs are apparent. Theoretically, liberty seemed sure at the South and at the North, but practically the reverse was true. Few men either in the Union or in the Confederacy had actual need of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus; but all able-bodied men at the South who were not too old were touched by the universal exaction of military service, and all who had property were affected by the impressment of it at an arbitrary price fixed by the government. The Federal government may be called a dictatorship. Congress and the people surrendered certain of their powers and rights to a trusted man. The Confederacy was a grand socialized state in which the government did everything. It levied directly on the produce of the land and fixed prices; it managed the railroads; operated manufacturing establishments; owned merchant vessels and carried on a foreign commerce. It did all this by common consent, and the public desired it to absorb even more activities. Frequent requests to extend the province of the general government, the states, and of the municipalities may be read in the newspapers and in the public and private letters of the time. The operation seemed too large for individual initiative, and the sovereign power of the state came to be invoked. It will always be an interesting question whether the affairs of the Confederacy outside of the military department were ably conducted. In the lower branches of administration they certainly were not. Nor did the Secretary of the Treasury display sufficient capacity to cope with the difficulties which environed him. The Post Office was badly managed, and it boots little to inquire whether this was due to untoward circumstances or to the Postmaster General's inefficiency. The State and Navy Departments seem to have availed themselves of their opportunities. Benjamin's work was not confined to foreign affairs, for he was Davis's intimate friend and confidential adviser. But he was suspected of corruption, and through his cotton speculations was believed to have carried to his credit in England a handsome sum of money. One part of this rumor was unfounded, for, after Benjamin landed in England, he was for some time nearly penniless. And if he made illicit gains, he spent them in the Confederacy. Indeed, he was one of the men who had lived well throughout the war. Davis naturally gave his attention to the War Department, of which the Secretary was said to be merely his chief clerk. If the frequently superfluous controversial letters of the Confederate President and Secretary of War be excepted, a study of the papers of Davis, Seddon, and Judge Campbell will give one a high idea of their executive talents. Indeed, any government might be proud of the ability shown in these documents. A certain class of facts, if considered alone, can make us wonder how it was possible to subjugate the Confederates. And this would certainly have been impossible of accomplishment without great political capacity at the head of the Northern government, and a sturdy support of Lincoln by the Northern people. Lincoln was a man of much greater ability than Davis, yet Davis was a worthy foeman. Davis suffered constantly from ill health, which was so persistent and so noised abroad that men were always conjecturing how the government would be carried on in the event of his death. In December, 1864, it was thought that he was suffering from brain disease and would surely die. His form was spare, his face emaciated, and he looked older than his years. The cares of the Confederacy weighed heavily upon him. But he had a sweet domestic life, and the devotion of a woman of brains and character. Those who like similitudes will recall that Lincoln and Davis each lost a beloved son during the war. Willie, at the age of 12, from an illness. Joseph, a little romping boy, died as the result of a fall from a portico to the brick pavement below. But if Davis had won, he would have been a hard master to be vanquished. "Does any one imagine," he asked in October, 1864, "that we can conquer the Yankees by retreating before them, or do you not all know that the only way to make spaniels civil is to whip them?" The moral height of Lincoln's second inaugural address was beyond his reach. Perhaps one of the reasons for the success of the North is given in the words of Shakespeare's Henry V. "When levity and cruelty play for a kingdom, the gentler gamester is the soonest winner." End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of History of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, by James Ford Rhodes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 13. Our story left William T. Sherman in camp at Atlanta during September, 1864. Mentally and bodily in his prime of 44, he had added to an ample book knowledge of his profession 3 years of fruitful experience in the field, whilst his warm friendship with Grant had proved of great advantage to each and to their country. Now his busy brain planned an extraordinary movement, a march to the sea. He proposed to leave Thomas to cope with Hood, while, to use his own words, he should make Georgia howl. But the President felt much solicitude at his leaving Hood in his rear, believing that a misstep might be fatal to his army. Meanwhile, Hood crossed the Tennessee River and invaded Tennessee. This movement made Grant doubt the wisdom of the plan, and he asked Sherman whether he had not better destroy Hood's army before starting southward. But Sherman, anticipating this objection, had already sent a dispatch to Grant allaying his misgivings, and drawing from him the word, "Go as you propose." The march to the sea, the march northward from Savannah, and Thomas's operations in Tennessee are a combination of bold and effective strategy, possible only after the Chattanooga-Atlanta campaign and a fit sequel to it. 100 persons may have conceived the design of advancing to the ocean, but the genius of the general lay in foreseeing the possible moves of his adversary, in guarding against them, and in his estimate of the physical and moral results of cutting the Confederacy in twain. Wise in precaution and fully conscious of the difficulties of the venture, Sherman showed the same boldness and tenacity in sticking to his purpose, when others shook their heads, as Grant had shown in his Vicksburg campaign. No general who lacked daring and resolution would have persisted in his determination to advance through Georgia after Hood had crossed the Tennessee River, especially when Grant himself for a while doubted the wisdom of the movement. Sherman was the commander, and even as he knew his men and comprehended the conditions, he knew he could expect no success unless Thomas should defeat Hood. Therein, as the affair turned out, lay the risk. But Sherman knew Thomas through and through. Classmates at West Point, they had ever since been friends, and had been drawn closer together by the vicissitudes of the Civil War, despite differences of opinion arising from their diverse temperaments. Sherman had implicit confidence in Thomas, thought that he had furnished him a force sufficient for all emergencies, and that the defense of Tennessee was not left to chance. "If I had Schofield," Thomas telegraphed, "I should feel perfectly safe." Sherman had already detached Schofield's corps from his army and sent it northward with instructions to report to Thomas for orders. On the day that Sherman started for the sea, Thomas sent this word: "I have no fear that Beauregard (Hood) can do us any harm now, and if he attempts to follow you, I will follow him as far as possible. If he does not follow you, I will then thoroughly organize my troops, and I believe I shall have men enough to ruin him, unless he gets out of the way very rapidly." At this time the Union commanders were uncertain whether Hood would follow Sherman, or move north toward Nashville. The army that marched to the sea proved unnecessarily large, and 10,000 men more with Schofield would have saved some trial of soul; yet, as the problem appeared at the time, Sherman must be sufficiently strong to defeat Hood, and the scattered forces of uncertain number which would gather to protect Georgia. Moreover, as his ultimate aim was to reinforce our armies in Virginia, he must have troops enough to oppose Lee until Grant should be at his heels. He reckoned that the force left in Tennessee was numerically greater than Hood's. Considering everything that could have been known between November 1st and 12th, it seems clear beyond dispute that he made a fair division of his army between himself and Thomas. Sherman reviewed his decision with deliberation, care, and foresight. Until within 6 days of his start southward, he held himself ready if need were to cooperate with Thomas in the pursuit of Hood, the one moving directly against the Confederates, and the other endeavoring to cut off their retreat, for he admitted that the first object should be the destruction of that army. But as the days wore on, he came to believe that the advantages of the march to the sea outweighed those of any other plan, and he took the irrevocable step. Stopping at Cartersville on November 12th, on his progress southward, he received Thomas's last dispatch, and replied, "All right." A bridge was burned, severing the telegraph wire and all communication with Thomas and his government. As was the case with Julian, who plunged into the recesses of the Martian or Black Forest, so was Sherman's fate for many days unknown to the world. No direct intelligence from him reached the North from November 12th to December 14th. "I will not attempt to send carriers back," he had written to Grant, "but trust to the Richmond papers to keep you well advised." For these 32 days, Lincoln and Grant had no other information of this important movement than what they could glean from the Southern journals. Sherman's imagination was vividly impressed with the strangeness of the situation. 2 hostile armies were marching in opposite directions, each in the full belief that it was achieving a final and conclusive result in the great war. It would be impossible to show an entire consistency in the utterances of this great general. A single aspect of the campaign often claimed his attention to the exclusion of all others, and he was so fertile in thought and fluent in expression that the idea uppermost in his brain was apt to burst forth without regard for what else remained behind. As with almost all men of action, the speculation of today might supersede that of yesterday, only to disappear under that of tomorrow. Yet this did not impair his capacity for making a correct decision, nor his steadfastness in the execution of a plan. Grant, more reticent and not at all expansive, is not chargeable in the same degree with inconsistency in his written words. He lacked imagination and did not worry. A remark of Sherman's provides an acute estimate of their different temperaments. Grant does not care for what the enemy does out of his sight, but it scares me." While the army was concentrating at Atlanta, the railway station, machine shops, and other buildings of that city which might be useful to the enemy in his military operations, were destroyed. The right wing and one corps of the left wing having started the day before, Sherman rode out of Atlanta on November 16th with the 14th Corps. He had in all 62,000 able bodied, experienced soldiers, well armed, well equipped and provided, as far as human foresight could, with all the essentials of life, strength, and vigorous action. One of the bands happening to play "John Brown's Body Lies a Mouldering in the Grave," the men sang the well known song, giving to the chorus, "Glory, glory, alleluia, his soul is marching on," a force full of meaning, as their minds reverted to the events which had taken place since that December day in 1859, when he who was now a saint in their calendar had suffered death on the scaffold. When the march to the sea began, the weather was fine, the air bracing, and the movement to the south and east exhilarated the men. Many of the common soldiers called out to their general, "Uncle Billy, I guess Grant is waiting for us at Richmond." There was a devil may care feeling pervading officers and men, related Sherman, that made me feel the full load of responsibility. The tale of the march is not one of battle and inch by inch progress, as was the campaign from Chattanooga to Atlanta. "As to the lion in our path," wrote Sherman after he had reached Savannah, "we never met him. Officers and men looked upon the march as a picnic, a vast holiday frolic." The burden was on the general in command. He was in the enemy's country. He must show his skill by keeping his large army supplied. When the army set out, it had approximately supplies of bread for 20 days, sugar, coffee, and salt for 40, and about 3 days' forage and grain. It had also a sufficient quantity of ammunition. All this was carried in 2,500 wagons with a team of 6 mules to each. Droves of cattle, enough to ensure fresh meat for more than a month, were part of the commissariat. The ambulances were 600 in number. The artillery had been reduced to 65 guns. Pontoon trains were carried along, as the invading host had many rivers to cross. The right wing was composed of the 15th and 17th Corps, the left of the 14th and 20th. Each corps marched on a separate road. The division of the wagon trains gave each corps about 800 wagons, which occupied on the march 5 miles or more of road. The artillery and wagons with their advance and rear guards had the right of way, the men taking improvised paths at their side. The troops began their daily march at dawn, and pitched their camp soon after noon, having covered ordinarily 10 to 15 miles. Milledgeville, the capital of the State, was reached by the left wing in 7 days. This march through the heart of Georgia so alarmed the Confederates lest either Macon or Augusta, or both, might be attacked, that they divided their forces; and when it finally became clear that Savannah was the point aimed at, they found it impossible for various reasons to concentrate a large number of troops for defense. By December 10th, the enemy was driven within his lines at Savannah, the march of 300 miles was over, and the siege began. The special field order of November 9th said, "The army will forage liberally on the country during the march." As the State was sparsely settled, and the plan of making requisitions on the civil authorities therefore impracticable, this was the only possible mode of supplying the troops. The arrangements for the foraging were made, and carried out with military precision. Each brigade sent out a party of about 50 men on foot, who would return mounted, driving cattle and mules, and hauling wagons or family carriages loaded with fresh mutton, smoked bacon, turkeys, chickens, ducks, corn meal, jugs of molasses, and sweet potatoes. As the crop was large, and had just been gathered and laid by for the winter, and as the region had never before been visited by a hostile army, the land was rich in provisions and forage. While Sherman and his officers sincerely endeavored to have the foraging done in an orderly way, the men were often riotous in seizing food on their own account. "A soldier passed me," so related the general, "with a ham on his musket, a jug of sorghum, molasses, under his arm, and a big piece of honey in his hand, from which he was eating, and catching my eye, he remarked in a low voice to a comrade, 'Forage liberally on the country.'" Sherman reproved the man, as he did others when similar acts of lawlessness fell under his observation, explaining that "foraging must be limited to the regular parties properly detailed." Full of pride in his soldiers, and elated at their manifestations of confidence in him, he had for them after the completion of the march only this mild censure: A little loose in foraging, they did some things they ought not to have done." A spirit of fun pervaded the army, which exhibited itself in innocent frolics, typical of which was the meeting of some officers in the Hall of Representatives at Milledgeville, where they constituted themselves the Legislature of the State of Georgia, elected a Speaker, and after a formal debate repealed by a fair vote the ordinance of secession. Destruction was a part of the business of the march, especially as Lee's army drew its supplies of provisions largely from Georgia. "The State of Georgia alone," said Jefferson Davis in a speech at Augusta, "produces food enough not only for her own people and the army within it, but feeds too the Army of Virginia." It became of the utmost importance to sever the railroad communication between the Gulf States and Richmond, and to this Sherman gave his personal attention. The bridges and trestles were burned, the masonry of the culverts blown up. In the destruction of the iron rails mechanical skill vied with native ingenuity in doing the most effective work. The chief engineer designed a machine for twisting the rails after heating them in the fires by burning the ties. This was used by Michigan and Missouri engineers. But the infantry, with the mania for destruction which pervaded the army, joined in the work, carrying the rails when they came to a red heat to the nearest trees and twisting them about the trunks, or warping them in some fantastic way so that they were useless except as old iron, and even as such in unmanageable shape for working in a mill. About 265 miles of railroad were thus destroyed. This, in the heart of Jeff Davis's empire, as Sherman called it, effected a damage almost irreparable owing to the scarcity of factories which could make rails for renewals, and to the embargo on imports by the blockade of the southern ports. Stations and machine shops along the lines were burned. Many thousand bales of cotton and a large number of cotton gins and presses were destroyed. At Milledgeville, Sherman reported, "I burned the railroad buildings and the arsenals. The State House and Governor's Mansion I left unharmed." The penitentiary had been burned by the convicts before the arrival of the army. A negro from whom Sherman asked information regarding the operations of the right wing, thus described what he had seen: "First there came along some cavalrymen, and they burned the depot. Then come along some infantrymen, and they tore up the track and burned it. And just before I left they sought fire to the well." In the main, the General forbore destroying private property, but in nearly all his dispatches after he reached the sea, he gloated over the destruction along the line of his march, writing from Savannah, "We have consumed the corn and fodder in the region of country 30 miles on either side of a line from Atlanta to Savannah, as also the sweet potatoes, cattle, hogs, sheep, and poultry, and have carried away more than 10,000 horses and mules, as well as a countless number of their slaves. I estimate the damage done to the State of Georgia and its military resources at $100 millions, at least $20 millions of which has inured to our advantage, and the remainder is simple waste and destruction. This may seem a hard species of warfare, but it brings the sad realities of war home to those who have been directly or indirectly instrumental in involving us in its attendant calamities. Well might be said afterwards, 'War is hell.'" Various orders given from time to time show that there was not only lawless foraging, but that there was an unwarranted burning of buildings. A more serious charge against these men of the Western army is pillage. Sherman admitted the truth of it, as did likewise General Cox. After the campaign, Sherman heard of jewelry being taken from women, and was of the opinion that these depredations were committed by parties of foragers usually called bummers. Cox dubbed with that name the habitual stragglers to whom he ascribed a large part of the irregular acts. Some of the pilfering was undoubtedly due to the uncontrollable American desire for mementos of places connected with great events. Moreover, while 3½ years of civil war had built up an effective fighting machine, they had caused a relaxation in the rules of orderly conduct among its members, so that it had become to be considered proper to despoil any one living in the enemy's country. But the commander and his officers sincerely desired to restrain the soldiers within the limits of civilized usage. The lofty personal character of most of the men in high command, and the severity of the punishment threatened for breaches of discipline are evidence of this; nor should it be overlooked that much of the plundering charged to Sherman's men was actually done by Confederate bands. From my general characterization of the Union officers, one notable exception must be made. Kilpatrick, the commander of the cavalry, was notorious for his immorality and rapacity, and his escapades, winked at by Sherman on account of his military efficiency, were demoralizing to the army at the time, and have since tended to give it a bad name. With no purpose of extenuation, it is pleasant to record some of Sherman's words which should be read in the light of his honesty of soul and truthfulness of statement. "I never heard," he wrote, "of any cases of murder or rape." Sherman's campaign struck slavery a staggering blow. Everywhere the negroes received the Northern soldiers with joy. Near Covington, an old gray haired negro said to Sherman that he had been looking for the angel of the Lord ever since he was knee high, and he supposed that the success of the Northern army would bring him freedom. Another, who was spokesman for a large number of fellow slaves, said to an aide de camp of the General's, "I's hope de Lord will prosper you Yankees and Mr. Sherman, 'cause I tinks, and we's all tinks, dat you's down here in our interests." At Milledgeville the negroes in their ecstasy shouted, "Bress de Lord! Tanks be to Almighty God, de Yanks is come! De day ob Jubilee hab arribed!" "Negro men, women, and children joined the column at every mile of our march," reported the commander of the left wing. The desire to realize their freedom at once was keen, and the number would have been far greater had not Sherman discouraged the negroes from following the army, as all but the young and able bodied who were put to use were a serious drawback, increasing the number of mouths to be fed, and causing constant apprehension lest they should hamper the movement of the troops, in the event that the enemy were encountered in formidable array. But the tidings that President Lincoln had proclaimed them all free was spread far and wide. The moral effect of the march to the sea was very great. "Sherman's campaign has produced bad effect on our people," wrote Jefferson Davis. At first it was popularly supposed at the South that the operation was hazardous, and that the Union army might be checked or even destroyed. The Union force was underrated. The Confederate means of defense were estimated too high, especially as they were so disposed as to be ineffective. The marching columns met with little resistance. The victorious progress of this "modern Attila," as Sherman was called, brought out indications that many people in the South were tired of the war. During the 32 days when the world lost sight of Sherman, the only news of him was from the Richmond newspapers which came through Grant's lines, and from other Southern journals, copious extracts from which were printed in the Northern dailies. The President was apprehensive for his safety; and, if Grant's recollection be correct, there was for a time considerable anxiety among the people at the North who had husbands, sons, or brothers in the invading army. The first word of his security was received in Washington on the evening of December 14th. 4 days later came a dispatch from Sherman himself, saying that he had opened communication with the fleet. On the night of December 20th, the Confederates evacuated Savannah. Sherman took possession of the city and sent his celebrated dispatch to President Lincoln, who received it opportunely on the evening of Christmas Day. "I beg to present you," the General said, "as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns, and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton." When the balance of probabilities seemed to indicate that Hood would invade Tennessee, Sherman, on parting with General J.D. Cox, whom he was sending northward, said, "If there's to be any hard fighting, you will have it to do." This turned out to be the case. Tempted by the division of the Union army, and aiming to distract Sherman's advance into Georgia, Hood, on November 21st, took the offensive and began his movement upon Nashville. His energy and alertness secured for him the advantage of superior numbers over General John M. Schofield, who endeavored to retard the Confederate advance so that Thomas might gain time for a concentration of the Union troops. Aware of his inferiority, Schofield executed a masterly retreat, and through strenuous exertions of officers and men arrived safely at Franklin, where the impetuous Hood forced him to fight with the river at his back. Hood made a desperate frontal attack, and was repulsed with terrible slaughter. General J.D. Cox shared with Schofield the credit for the brilliant victory. The Union troops, under orders from Thomas, marched to Nashville. Hood followed Schofield to Nashville, and sat down before the city with an army now reduced to 26,000, inviting his doom. The reason he gave for continuing his advance northward was stated in his report of December 11th: to force the enemy to take the initiative. Thomas had now at Nashville 49,000 men. Thomas understood the position of affairs, and knew that he should attack Hood. Feeling pretty sure that Hood would not attempt an advance to the Ohio River, or retreat southward, he was making his preparations complete with the aim of striking the Confederates a crushing blow. Meanwhile Grant was growing impatient; the more so as personally he did not like Thomas. The two were unsympathetic, and their view of military movements was diverse. Grant loved Sherman and Sheridan, and was always ready to overlook their shortcomings, but his attitude toward Thomas during these December days was that of an unrelenting fault finder. Knowing that Hood's defeat was necessary for the success of Sherman's campaign, he could not control his annoyance at the delay. "Attack Hood at once," was his order of December 6th. As no attack was made, he purposed relieving Thomas and placing Schofield in command; but suspending for a space the issuance of an order to this effect, he telegraphed to Thomas on December 11th, "Let there be no further delay." Meanwhile a storm of sleet had converted the hills about Nashville into slopes of slippery ice, rendering any movement impossible until there should be a thaw. This was reported to Grant, who appeared to see in the intelligence only a further excuse for delay. In his unreasonable mood, he ordered General Logan to proceed to Nashville for the purpose of superseding Thomas in command of the Army of the Cumberland. Then, growing still more anxious, he decided to go thither himself, and had reached Washington on the way when he received word that Thomas had made the attack. Grant had been unjust to Thomas, looking at only one side of his character. While Thomas was deliberate unto slowness, he had the situation well in hand after the battle of Franklin, and was admirably fitted to cope with an impetuous general like Hood. This Sherman had divined when placing upon him such a weight of responsibility. Moreover, he had the confidence and devotion of his soldiers. In whatever way the circumstances may be regarded, there was no justification for superseding him by Schofield or Logan; and the sequel showed that he was abundantly equal to the demands made upon him. On December 15th, Thomas attacked Hood, and in the course of that day and the next struck him a crushing blow. When in the spring of 1864, Grant took command of all the armies of the United States, the two salient features of his plan were the destruction or capture of Lee's army, and the crushing of the Confederate force in the Southwest. Before the close of the year, one half of the work had been accomplished. Hood's army was disintegrated. Not all, to be sure, of that compact and well disciplined force of 53,000 with which Johnston had begun to resist Sherman's advance in May, had been killed, wounded, or made prisoners, but through casualties, desertions, and forced furloughs, practically none of it was left as a fighting body. As an army it is no longer known in the annals of the war, although two detachments of it appear to recall to us its wrecked fortunes. 9,000 of these discouraged and partially equipped soldiers turned up under Johnston in North Carolina, and in 1692 went to Mobile. Jefferson Davis had unwittingly helped to bring about the destruction of the Confederate force in the Southwest, by removing Joseph E. Johnston and placing Hood in command. Sherman began the ruin of Hood's army about Atlanta. Schofield gave it a severe blow at Franklin. Thomas completed the work at Nashville. There was good generalship. They were brave, devoted, and energetic officers and men. Of course, Sherman's successful march to the sea would have been a bitter disappointment to the North without Thomas's victory at Nashville; but the two together formed an important part of the grand scheme which broke down the military resistance of the South. The great achievement, the capture of Lee's army, still remained. While the people were rejoicing in the merriest season of the year over the success of Sherman and of Thomas, the President, Grant, and Sherman were evolving the plan which would end the Civil War. The President earnestly desired the adoption of a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery in the United States forever. Such an amendment had passed the Senate at the previous session, but it had failed to secure the requisite two-thirds vote in the House. It was still the same House of Representatives, but the President pointed out that the voice of the people as manifested in the national election was for the amendment, and that the House, which should come into being on March 4, 1865, would certainly pass it. Therefore, as it is certain to go to the States for their action, may we not agree that the sooner the better? He recommended the reconsideration and passage of the amendment. On January 31, 1865, his ardent wish was gratified. When the Speaker announced that the constitutional majority of two-thirds had voted in the affirmative, there was great enthusiasm. In honor of the immortal and sublime event, the House adjourned. This amendment, which is now known as the 13th, was in due time ratified by 3/4 of the States. To contrast the amendment which Congress intended in March, 1861, to have numbered 13, with the existing addition to our Organic Act, is to comprehend the mighty revolution of 4 years. That of 1861 reads: "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere within any State with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said State." That of 1865, which is a part of our Constitution: "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." The South was approaching exhaustion. Sherman's march through Georgia and Hood's defeat at Nashville had bred a feeling of despondency far and wide. Lee called attention to the alarming frequency of desertions from his army which were due mainly to the insufficiency of food and non-payment of the troops. Even the Confederate paper money was not to be had, although this was fast losing value. $60 of it were needed to buy $1 in gold. Beef sold for $6 a pound, and flour for $1,000 a barrel. The weather was cold and fuel scarce. Jones makes a record of the mercury at 0 and wood selling at $5 a stick. In the midst of this distress came the news that Fort Fisher had fallen. This closed Wilmington, North Carolina, the last open port of the Confederacy. Blockade running was now at an end. The trade with Europe of cotton and tobacco for needed supplies, on which the South had lived and carried on the war, must now cease. As the existence of the Confederacy depended on Lee's army, the most serious feature of a very grave situation was the lack of food for his soldiers. Sherman's march had cut off the supplies from Georgia, but meat and corn could be obtained from Southwest Virginia and the Carolinas. The permanent way, however, of the Richmond and Danville Railroad, on which the transportation of this food depended, had not been kept up. The locomotives, cars, and machinery generally were out of repair, so that the daily wants of the commissariat could hardly be met. Lee reported that the whole country within reach of his army had been swept clear. The Commissary General wrote that for several months the Army of Northern Virginia had been living literally from hand to mouth. The overpowering difficulty was the lack of money. In North Carolina producers refused to sell, as they feared the government would not pay. In a number of Virginia counties along the Potomac the people, who had formerly held that patriotism required them to take Confederate money and refuse greenbacks, would now sell their cattle and hogs only for United States currency, cotton or gold. In Virginia generally gold or greenbacks were necessary to obtain horses. The value of the paper currency of a nation is a symptom of the nation's stability, and men had it thus brought home to them in the common operations of life, that the financial system of the Confederacy had broken down, while the enemy's money was eagerly sought for within its borders. A natural step in reasoning led to a distrust of the whole Southern enterprise. Traffic across the lines with country under control of the Union forces was an important source of supply for Lee's army. This traffic, which consisted in the exchange of cotton for subsistence stores, was carried on largely by agents of the Confederate government. Despondency and discontent filled the public mind. President Davis was discontented with his Congress, and Congress was equally discontented with him; and many people were dissatisfied with both. The General Assembly of Virginia by unanimous vote expressed the opinion that Lee's appointment to the command of all the armies would promote their efficiency, and reanimate the spirit of both soldiers and people. This was communicated deferentially and in confidence to Davis, who, with ready sympathy, replied that he fully agreed with the Assembly. Shortly afterwards he appointed Lee General in Chief. It is significant that all men, no matter how they might differ in other respects, turned with one accord to Lee as their savior, if indeed salvation were to be had. His personal influence is illustrated by a circumstance occurring at this time. Heavy rains had destroyed a part of the Richmond and Danville Railroad, which was the main source of supply for his army, so that food could not be transported over it for a number of days. On a suggestion from the War Department, Lee made a personal appeal to the farmers, millers, and other citizens to give him food, and although it was probable that nothing could have been impressed in that section, these men willingly brought in supplies sufficient to tide the army over its difficulty. Far below Lee in the public estimation came Jefferson Davis. Yet next to Lee he was the strongest individual influence in this time of distress. The power which he exercised by virtue of his office, together with the fact that his opponents lacked a leader, made it difficult to discern what was public opinion. All yearned for peace, and everybody would have been willing to give the North liberal conditions if she would grant independence to the Confederacy. This view was shared by Davis, who, however, did not fully comprehend the widespread demoralization of the South. His hopefulness gave him strength to rise above illness and a constant debility. He was inflexible, and lacked tact in an eminent degree. Criticism was rife, and various plans were proposed, but, with rare exceptions, men failed to grasp the actual situation. That by superior resources and more efficient management, the North had beaten the South. But it is impossible to tell how many saw the inevitable, that there could be no peace except by reunion and the abolition of slavery, and were willing to submit to these conditions. Thus matters were allowed to drift. The only feasible plan from a military point of view was to confer freedom on all slaves who would take up arms for the Confederacy. During the year 1864 the enlistment of slaves began to be mooted; and on January 11, 1865, this policy received the sanction of General Lee, who proposed immediate freedom to all who should enlist, and at the same time recommended a well digested plan of gradual and general emancipation. Congress did not act promptly on Lee's recommendation, and if there was any virtue in such a policy, it was now too late to avail anything. The enlistment of the slaves was strongly opposed, and Howell Cobb, who at the commencement of the war owned 1,000 negroes, argued against it with force. "The day you make soldiers of them the negroes," he wrote, "is the beginning of the end of the Revolution. If slaves will make good soldiers, our whole theory of slavery is wrong." In truth, it might have been asked, if we are voluntarily going to free our slaves, wherefore did we secede and go to war? But in January, 1865, nearly all Southerners, if asked, "What are you fighting for?" would have answered, "For our independence and against subjugation." Through the officious interference of Francis P. Blair, Sr., a conference was brought about between Lincoln and Seward on the one side, and Vice President Stevens, Judge Campbell, and Senator Hunter on the other. Known as the Hampton Roads Conference, it took place on board a United States steamer anchored near Fort Monroe, February 3rd. When personal courtesies had been passed, and Whig memories revived between Lincoln and Stevens, Stevens asked, "Mr. President, is there no way of putting an end to the present trouble?" Lincoln replied in substance that "there is but one way I know of, and that is for those who are resisting the laws of the Union to cease that resistance. The restoration of the Union is a sine qua non with me." Judge Campbell inquired how restoration was to take place, supposing that the Confederate States consented to it. Lincoln replied, "By disbanding their armies, and permitting the national authorities to resume their functions." Slavery was discussed. The President said that "he never would change or modify the terms of the proclamation in the slightest particular," and Seward told the Southerners that the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery had just been passed by Congress. If the Confederate States were to abandon the war, asked Stevens, would they be admitted to representation in Congress? Lincoln replied that he thought that they ought to be, but he could not enter into any stipulation upon the subject. When Stevens pressed the point that there should be some understanding, Lincoln said that he could not treat with parties in arms against the government. Hunter said that "this had been often done, especially by Charles I, when at civil war with the British Parliament." Lincoln replied, "I do not profess to be posted in history. On all such matters I will turn you over to Seward. All I distinctly recollect about the case of Charles I is that he lost his head in the end." After further discussion, Lincoln burst out, "Stevens, if I resided in Georgia with my present sentiments, I'll tell you what I would do if I were in your place. I would go home and get the governor of the State to call the legislature together, and get them to recall all the State troops from the war, elect senators and members to Congress, and ratify this constitutional amendment, the 13th, prospectively, so as to take effect, say in 5 years. Whatever may have been the views of your people before the war, they must be convinced now that slavery is doomed. It cannot last long in any event, and the best course, it seems to me, for your public men to pursue, would be to adopt such a policy as will avoid as far as possible the evils of immediate emancipation. This would be my course, if I were in your place." Hunter summed up the talk, saying that nothing had been offered them but unconditional submission to the mercy of the conquerors. This Seward disclaimed in courteous terms, and Lincoln said that as far as the confiscation acts and other penal acts were concerned, their enforcement was left entirely with him, and on that point he was perfectly willing to be full and explicit, and on his assurance perfect reliance might be placed. He should exercise the power of the executive with the utmost liberality. He went on to say that he would be willing to be taxed to remunerate the Southern people for their slaves. He believed the people of the North were as responsible for slavery as people of the South, and if the war should then cease, with the voluntary abolition of slavery by the States, he should be in favor, individually, of the government paying a fair indemnity for the loss to their owners. He said he believed this feeling had an extensive existence at the North. He knew some who were in favor of an appropriation as high as $400,000,000 for this purpose. But on this subject he said he could give no assurance, enter into no stipulation. He barely expressed his own feelings and views, and what he believed to be the views of others on the subject. In the President's report to the House of Representatives he said, "The conference ended without result." Two men, Lee and Davis, acting together, could have led the Confederate Congress and the South. Lee's caution, his deference to his superior, and his aversion to assuming a responsibility that was not clearly his, probably prevented him from urging his President to negotiate a peace. But if the memories of private conversation may be believed, he had lost all hope of success. It was Jefferson Davis who in this matter imposed his will on all his subordinates, and it was he more than anybody else who stood in the way of an attempt to secure favorable terms for the South in a reconstruction of the Union. If Davis, Lee, and the Confederate Congress could have made up their minds to sue for peace, the contemporaneous occurrences in Washington reveal the magnanimous spirit in which they would have been met by Abraham Lincoln. 2 days after the Hampton Roads Conference, on Sunday evening, February 5th, the President called his cabinet together to consult them in regard to a message he proposed to send, recommending that Congress empower him to pay to the 11 slave States of the Southern Confederacy, then in arms against the Union, and to the 5 Union slave States $400,000,000 as compensation for their slaves, provided that all resistance to the national authority should cease on April 1st next. The cabinet unanimously disapproved this project, and Lincoln, with a deep sigh, said, "You are all opposed to me, and I will not send the message." Such a proposal to the Southern Confederacy, tottering to her fall only 63 days before Lee's surrender to Grant, would have shown magnanimous foresight. Had the Confederates accepted it, there would have been an immediate fraternal union after the Civil War. Had they rejected it, the President and Congress would have made a noble record. The offer, however, was too wise and too generous to be widely approved of men. Lincoln, of all those in authority, had reached a moral height where he must dwell alone and impotent. But when reflecting on the events from 1865 to 1877, men may well wish that the offer had been made. A month later, in the spirit of this Sunday, Lincoln uttered the sublime words of his second inaugural address, the greatest of presidential inaugurals, one of the noblest of state papers. End of Chapter 13. Chapter 14 of History of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, by James Ford Rhodes. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 14. Sherman, with an army of 60,000, which was substantially the same as that which he had led from Atlanta to Savannah, started northward from Savannah on February 1st, in the execution of a plan devised by himself, and on March 23rd reached Goldsboro, North Carolina, having covered the 425 miles in 50 days. His progress to the sea had been a frolic, the march northward a long wrestle with the elements. At the outset, the First Division encountered a deluging rain, causing a rise in the Savannah River, which burst its dikes, washed over the road, and nearly drowned many of the troops. Waiting until this flood abated, and passing successfully the difficulties occasioned by the high water in the neighborhood of Savannah, the army plunged into the swamps of the Combahee and Edisto, and floundered through the flat quagmires of the river countries of the Pedee and Cape Fear. They crossed 5 large navigable rivers, which the almost continuous rains of the winter had converted into lakes, at times marching through icy water waist deep. One day, as Sherman related the incident, while my men were wading a river which was surrounded for miles by swamps on each side. After they had been in the water for about an hour without much prospect of reaching the other side, one of them cried out to his chum, "Say, Tommy, I'm blowed if I don't believe we've struck this river lengthways." Where the country was not actually under water there was deep mud. The incessant downpour made roads which were always difficult almost impassable, turned swampy ways into deep quagmires. "It was chaos come again," wrote Cox, but the chaos was bridged for hundreds of miles by this indomitable army. The roads were corduroyed; the streams and rivers were crossed on pontoon and trestle bridges. It would have been a difficult region for an army to march through had the inhabitants been friendly and no enemy near; but under the direction of Wheeler's cavalry, details of negro laborers had felled trees, burned bridges, and made obstructions to impede Sherman's progress. To gain possession of the long causeways through the swamps, it was necessary to outflank the enemy and drive him off. For this and other reasons there were skirmishes nearly every day, yet the army marched at the average daily rate of 10 miles. "Sherman seems to have everything his own way," wrote Lee from Petersburg. "I made up my mind," said Joseph E. Johnston, "that there had been no such army since the days of Julius Caesar." The 2,500 wagons of the army carried a full supply of ammunition and a large number of government rations. The initial food supply was eked out, and systematic foraging upon the country was carried on in the manner which had proved so successful in the campaign from Atlanta to the sea. The march began in South Carolina, continued directly through the center of the state, and was marked by a line of buildings and cotton bales of hire. The soldiers tore up the railroads, applied the torch to their woodwork, twisted the rails and destroyed all water tanks, engines, and machinery. The Confederates set fire to cotton to prevent its falling into the hands of the Union army, and what they spared was burned by the Northern soldiers in the territory which they were merely traversing, and could not hope to occupy permanently. In the high circles of the army a bitter feeling existed against South Carolina as the cause of all the trouble of the past 4 years. "The whole army," Sherman wrote, "is burning with insatiable desire to wreak vengeance upon South Carolina. I almost tremble at her fate, but feel that she deserves all that seems in store for her." With such sentiments at headquarters, it is little wonder that the rank and file thought it legitimate to despoil the enemy and set fire to his houses. Still most of these irregular acts were committed by stragglers. Sherman's orders may probably be justified from the military point of view, but they left loopholes for the mania for destruction; and the necessities of the case and the burden of responsibility resting upon him may have caused him to wink at the havoc wrought by his army. The evidence shows, however, that many of the general officers did their best to stop the depredations of their soldiers, and some punishments were inflicted. From this statement must again be excepted Kilpatrick, whose command suffered no restraint and were forward in destruction and pillage. The most notorious occurrence during this march was the partial destruction by fire of Columbia, the capital of South Carolina; but this was due neither to Sherman nor to Wade Hampton, nor any other Federal or Confederate officer. The occupation of Columbia by Sherman compelled the abandonment of Charleston on February 18th by the Confederates. Efforts were made to collect a force which should be able to resist the Union army, but in view of the steadily advancing host, they seem to have been puny and at any rate were of no avail. When Davis heard that the evacuation of Charleston was necessary, he wrote, "I had hoped for other and better results, and the disappointment is to me extremely bitter." In Charleston much property was destroyed, but it was the Confederates who, through accident or design, were the agents of destruction. The Federal troops, on entering the city, found public buildings, stores, warehouses, railroad bridges, private dwellings, and cotton afire, but they afterwards wreaked their vengeance on this cradle of secession by robbery and pillage. Probably the majority of Northern people at the time had no other idea of Charleston's distress than that it was abundantly deserved; but the suffering and want in this former abode of wealth and refinement must evoke in us now sympathy with the community on whom the horrors of war were visited. To understand the march through South Carolina, the hatred of officers and soldiers for the State which had taken the lead in the secession movement must be borne constantly in mind. This undoubtedly led many of them into transgressions which they had not committed in Georgia, and from which they afterwards refrained in North Carolina, while it furnished the stragglers a ready excuse for their robberies and outrages. General Blair reported on March 7th, that every house on his line of march to day was pillaged, trunks broken open, jewelry, silver, etc., taken. Cox had evidence after the war of robberies and even partial hanging to extort the disclosure of a place where money and valuables were hidden. Stragglers, deserters from either army, marauders, bummers, and strolling vagabonds, negroes and whites committed outrages upon the inhabitants. 3 cases of rape and 1 of murder were reported. In some cases punishment was inflicted. Howard directed that a soldier who had violently taken a watch from a citizen should have his head shaved and be drummed out of the service. Cox, who commanded the 23rd Corps in Schofield's army, executed the death sentence pronounced by court-martial for a rape. The culprit, according to his recollection, was a bounty jumper. A military commission, having found a private soldier guilty of the murder of a North Carolina citizen, sentenced him to be shot to death with musketry. 2 days later the sentence was executed. Sherman asserted generally that whenever individuals were detected in theft they were punished; but in going over the evidence one cannot fail to note many offenses and few penalties. Yet, despite the general lawlessness of which we obtain glimpses from time to time, outrages on the persons of women were rare. Sherman testified under oath that in the whole of the march he heard of but 2 cases of rape. The tendency of Federal officers, apart from the contemporary documents, has been to minimize the depredations, and the tendency of many Northern writers has been to gloss them over, so that even if every instance brought to light by Northern testimony be mentioned, the Union armies will suffer no injustice by the seeming redundancy of facts. So much of the Southern evidence is not specific, and all of it is so pervaded with intense feeling, that I have preferred to develop this subject from Northern sources, leaving the natural inference to be drawn that, if all had been told, the evidence against Sherman's army would have been somewhat greater. The men who followed Sherman were probably more humane generally than those in almost any European army that had marched and fought before our Civil War; but any invading host in the country of the enemy is a terrible scourge. Sherman reached Fayetteville, North Carolina, on March 11th, and, by means of a steam tug which had come up the Cape Fear River from Wilmington, was placed in communication with Schofield and therefore with Grant and Stanton. Up to February 22nd, Grant, through the Richmond newspapers, had kept pretty well informed of Sherman's progress, but on that day the newspapers were requested by the authorities not to publish any news connected with the pending military movements in the Carolinas, so that afterwards he could cull from them only meager and unsatisfactory information. In his letter to Grant, Sherman said: "The army is in splendid health, condition, and spirit, although we have had foul weather and roads that would have stopped travel to almost any other body of men I ever read of." On March 21st, Schofield reached Goldsboro, North Carolina, where 2 days later Sherman's army made with him the desired junction. "Were I to express my measure of the relative importance of the march to the sea and of that from Savannah northward," wrote Sherman, "I would place the former at 1 and the latter at 10, or the maximum." He might have continued in Napoleon's words written during his Austrian campaign, "I have destroyed the enemy merely by marches." Sherman himself went to City Point to have a consultation with Grant, and there met President Lincoln. The 3 had 2 interviews, one on the afternoon of March 27th, and the other next day, when they discussed the past operations, the harbinger of their success, and the approaching end of the war. Lincoln and Sherman did most of the talking, while Grant listened and ruminated. According to Sherman's recollection of the interviews, the 2 generals were agreed in their opinion that one or the other of them would have to fight one more bloody battle, and that it would be the last. Lincoln said more than once that enough of blood had been shed, and asked if another battle could not be avoided, to which Sherman made answer that they could not control that event. It rested with Jefferson Davis and General Lee whether or not the 2 armies should meet again in a desperate and bloody battle. In truth, these masters of state and war, the 3 men to whom above all others we owe the successful termination of the conflict, could not without gladness review the military operations of the last year, and look forward to the promise of the future. But they appreciated too well the magnitude of the business in hand to give way to undue elation. As in May, 1864, Grant was confronted by Lee, and Sherman by Johnston; but Grant had fought his way from the Rapidan to the James and the Appomattox, while Sherman, after a contested progress from Dalton to Atlanta, had made a holiday march to the sea, followed by a march northward with the elements for his bitterest foes. He had achieved his purpose, and was now at Goldsboro, North Carolina, with 80,000 men, preparing to advance against Johnston, who lay between him and Raleigh with an army of about 33,000. In other parts of the theater of war there were large and well appointed Union forces bent on aggressive operations, working under Grant's efficient direction with the common purpose of dealing the enemy a final blow. But it was confidently believed that if Lee and Johnston could be forced to surrender, the rest of the military resistance would collapse. In this final encounter, the generals were well matched in intellectual ability, but the material resources on the Union side were vastly greater. Yet the latent power of resistance in soldiers, skillfully and honestly led, who believe that they are fighting against the subjugation of their people, must be rated high, as so many instances in history attest. The more profound the study of the last days of the Confederacy, the firmer will be the conviction that the best of management was required of the North to assure the end of the war in the spring of 1865. In one respect fortune had signally favored the Union. Although distributing in the last 2 years of the war the favors of military skill with an equal hand, she had at the same time given to the United States a great ruler. Manifestly superior as had been Davis's advantages in family, breeding, training, and experience, he fell far below Lincoln as a compeller of men. We have seen Lincoln in times of adversity and gloom, and have marveled at his self-effacement, and we have seen him listening to words of advice, warning, and even reproof, such as are rarely spoken to men wielding immense power; and throughout he has preserved his native dignity and emerged from nearly every trial a stronger and more admirable man. Grant appears at his best in the final operations of his army. He is the Grant of Donelson, Vicksburg, and Chattanooga, with a judgment developed through larger experience and the discipline of adversity. The full reports and detailed dispatches admit us to the actual operations of his mind, as he surveyed the vast field over which his armies, always in touch with him, moved to their several tasks in his grand scheme of strategy. He combined self-confidence with caution. He did not underestimate his enemy. He did not, as he perceived the successful operation of his plans, give way to elation, thinking the work already done which was only half done. But he was not too cautious to move forward boldly and without fear of the result. In Sherman and Sheridan he had helpers on whom he could rely as if each were another self. Seeing things alike, they were in complete sympathy with him. They comprehended his orders, and carried them out in letter and spirit as did no other of his subordinates. Sherman's marching and fighting were now over, but Sheridan was to be to Grant a prop and a weapon such as Stonewall Jackson had been to Lee in his earlier campaigns. With the force immediately under him, Grant had, besides Sheridan, an efficient coadjutor in Meade, and good corps commanders in Warren, Humphreys, Ord, Wright, and Parke. At the commencement of the Appomattox campaign, he had in this army 116,000 effectives, while Lee mustered 52,000. Since the summer of 1864, Grant had besieged Richmond and Petersburg. The progress of the siege had been slow but persistent, until soon after the middle of February, Lee began to consider the eventuality of abandoning both cities. While in the freedom of private conversation he may have expressed himself in a despairing tone, his dispatches indicated a belief that there was still a chance of success in fighting on. Moreover, he made it clear that he would resist the foe as long as resistance was possible, unless he were advised to yield by the superior civil authority. He infused an energy into his sortie of March 25th, which, though the attempt was unsuccessful, demonstrated that there was still a great deal of fight in him and in his army. The Union lines did not encircle Richmond and Petersburg, but left open an avenue of escape to the west and southwest. The Richmond and Danville Railroad and its Petersburg connection, the South Side or Lynchburg Railroad, which were the lines of supply for Richmond and Petersburg, were in operation. Grant spent days of anxiety lest Lee should abandon these places, and after getting away from him, either make a junction with Johnston, or retreating by way of Lynchburg, secure himself in the mountain fastnesses and make a raid into East Tennessee. Should the two Confederates unite their forces, he feared a long, tedious, and expensive campaign, consuming most of the summer. Lee considered the two alternatives, and preferred the union with Johnston; but if Davis's memory may be trusted, Lee never contemplated surrender, but in emulation of a plan of Washington's, purposed as a last resort retreating to the Virginia mountains, where he thought that he might carry on the war for 20 years. Taking all conditions into account, the game was equal, and was played with skill on each side. On March 29th, Grant began his movement on his own left, and at night had an unbroken line from the Appomattox River to the Dinwiddie Court House. From his headquarters in the field he wrote to Sheridan: "I now feel like ending the matter if it is possible to do so without going back." 2 nights and a day of heavy rain interrupted operations, but on the 31st the advance was resumed, when Lee attacked the Fifth Corps and the Union cavalry and gained a temporary success. Sheridan, in falling back, wrote Grant, "displayed great generalship." On April 1st Sheridan fought in a masterful way the Battle of Five Works, which resulted in disaster to the Confederates. "He has carried everything before him," is Grant's account of this action. The General in Chief received the intelligence of the victory of Five Forks at 9 in the evening, and immediately ordered an assault on the enemy's line, which was made at an early hour next day. His army won a decisive victory. On the night of April 2d, Lee evacuated Richmond and Petersburg, with the intention of concentrating his troops at Amelia Court House, and making his way to Danville, whence he would effect a junction with Johnston's army. After him next morning followed the Union forces in eager pursuit. As late as April 1st, Davis apparently thought that there was no immediate necessity for the abandonment of Richmond. On the morning of Sunday the 2d he was at St. Paul's, listening to the noble liturgy of the Episcopal Church. The clergyman was reading for the last time in his ministry the prayer for the President of the Confederate States. Here Davis was apprised by a messenger from the War Department of the gravity of the military situation. He left his pew quietly, and walked out of the church with dignity to receive Lee's telegram, which gave an account of his disaster, and advised that Richmond be abandoned. The news spread rapidly, and so unexpectedly had it come upon the city, that the greatest confusion and excitement prevailed as functionaries and citizens made ready for flight. Davis, with all the members of his cabinet except the Secretary of War, a number of his staff and other officials, got away at 11 o'clock in the evening on a train of the Richmond and Danville Railroad, and reached Danville next afternoon in safety. Under Lee's previous order, Ewell, who was in command of the troops in Richmond, directed that the tobacco in the city should be burned, and that all stores which could not be removed should be destroyed. It is probable that the fires lighted in pursuance of this order spread to shops and houses, and it is certain that in the early morning of April 3d a mob of both colors and both sexes set fire to buildings, and began to plunder the city. Ewell said in his report that by daylight the riot was subdued, and Jones wrote that at 7 o'clock in the morning men went to the liquor shops in execution of an order of the city government, and commanded that the spirits be poured into the streets. The gutters ran with liquor, from which pitchers and buckets were filled by black and white women and boys. By 7 o'clock also, the evacuation of Richmond by the Confederates was completed. The Union troops passed cautiously the first line of the Confederate works, but as they met with no opposition, they went by the next lines at a double quick, and when the spires of the city came into view, they unfurled a national banner, and their bands striking up "Rally round the flag," they sent up cheer on cheer as they marched in triumph through the streets. But they found confusion, an extensive conflagration, and a reign of pillage and disorder. Their commander, Weitzel, received the surrender of Richmond at the City Hall at 8:15, and by 2 o'clock in the afternoon they had quelled the tumult and put out the fires, but not before a considerable portion of the city had been destroyed. The Union soldiers were received by the white people gratefully, and by the negroes with joy. Full of meaning was the visit of President Lincoln to Richmond, which was made from City Point next day, in an unostentatious and careless manner. Proper arrangements had been made for his conveyance and escort, but, owing to 2 accidents, the President completed his river journey in a 12-oared barge, and walked about 1.5 miles through the Richmond streets, accompanied by Admiral Porter and 3 other officers, with a guard of only 10 sailors armed with carbines. He was received with demonstrations of joy by the negroes, and, though the city was full of drunken civilians, he met with neither molestation nor indignity. He went to the house which Davis had occupied as a residence, now Weitzel's headquarters, and, if we may believe some personal recollections, looked about the house and sat in Davis's chair with boyish delight. Lincoln passed the night in Richmond, and on April 5th returned to City Point. Under that date, Jones reported perfect order in the city, and Dana telegraphed from Richmond, "Whig appeared yesterday as Union paper. Theater opens here to night." The Army of Northern Virginia evacuated Richmond and Petersburg during the night of April 2d and the early morning of the 3rd. Grant, without tarrying for a visit to Richmond, set after them in hot pursuit. After a chase of 80 miles, he hemmed them in and compelled their surrender. When Lee became convinced that further resistance was useless, he said, "Then there is nothing left me but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." He ordered the white flag to be displayed, requested by letter a suspension of hostilities and an interview with Grant. The two generals met at McLean's house, in the little village of Appomattox Court House. Lee wore a new full dress uniform of Confederate gray, buttoned to the throat, and a handsome sword, the hilt of which was studded with jewels, while Grant had on a blouse of dark blue flannel unbuttoned in front, and carried no sword. "In my rough traveling suit," wrote Grant, "the uniform of a private with the straps of lieutenant general, I must have contrasted very strangely with a man so handsomely dressed, 6 feet high, and of faultless form." Although jubilant over his victory, Grant, on coming into personal contact with Lee, felt like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly. Grant was magnanimous, Lee heroic in his adversity. Generous terms were offered, and the paper signed that ended the war. The number of men surrendered was 28,231. The Confederates had been living for the last few days principally upon parched corn, and were badly in need of food. Grant supplied them with rations. As soon as the Union soldiers heard of the surrender, they commenced firing salutes at different points along the lines. He ordered these stopped, saying, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again; and the best sign of rejoicing after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field." Lee rode back sorrowfully to his soldiers. With eyes full of tears, he said, "We have fought through the war together. I have done the best I could for you. My heart is too full to say more." On the morrow he issued a farewell address to the Army of Northern Virginia, and rode away to Richmond. The army disbanded and dispersed to their homes. The news of Lee's surrender was received in Washington at 9 o'clock on Sunday evening, April 9th, and at a somewhat later hour in other cities. While the people had exulted at the occupation of Richmond, they perceived that the possession of the capital of the Confederacy did not imply the end of the war. But now it was in everybody's mouth. The great captain of the rebellion had surrendered. This imported that slavery was dead, the Union restored, and that the nation lived. So pregnant an event ought to be made known speedily to Europe. Accordingly, the Inman line dispatched a special steamer on the Monday to carry the intelligence across the ocean. The people of the North rejoiced on the night of the 9th, and during the day and evening of the 10th, as they had never rejoiced before; nor did they on any occasion during the remainder of the century show such an exuberance of gladness. Business was suspended and the courts adjourned. Cannons fired, bells rang, flags floated, houses and shops were gay with the red, white, and blue. There were illuminations and bonfires. The streets of the cities and towns were filled with men who shook hands warmly, embraced each other, shouted, laughed, and cheered, and were indeed beside themselves in their great joy. There were pledges in generous wine, and much common drinking in bar rooms and liquor shops. There were fantastic processions, grotesque performances, and some tomfoolery. Grave and old gentlemen forgot their age and dignity and played the pranks of schoolboys. But always above these foolish and bibulous excesses sounded the patriotic and religious note of the Jubilee. "Praise God from whom all blessings flow," were the words most frequently sung in the street, the Board of Trade, and the Stock Exchange. One writer recorded that in the bar room of Willard's Hotel, Washington, when the news arrived, an elderly gentleman sprang upon the bar and led the crowd in singing with unwonted fervor the well-known doxology. 20,000 men in Wall Street sang it with uncovered heads. On the Tuesday, Trinity Church, New York, was crowded for a special service. The choir chanted the Te Deum, and at the bidding of the clergyman, the congregation rose, and inspired by the great organ, and guided by the choir, sang the noble anthem, Gloria in Excelsis. These opening words, "Glory be to God on high, and on earth peace, good will towards men," had a peculiar significance to the Northern people, who during these days of rejoicing were for the most part full of generous feeling for the South. Patriotism expressed itself in the songs "John Brown's Body," "My Country, 'tis of Thee," "Rally round the Flag," and the "Star Spangled Banner." Lowell instinctively put into words what his countrymen had in their hearts. "The news, my dear Charles, is from heaven. I felt a strange and tender exaltation. I wanted to laugh and I wanted to cry, and ended by holding my peace and feeling devoutly thankful. There is something magnificent in having a country to love." The surrender of Johnston to Sherman naturally followed Lee's surrender. The war was over. Between these two events our country suffered the greatest disaster in its history. Lincoln was assassinated. Walt Whitman sang, "O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack, the prize we sought is won. O Captain, my Captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up! For you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills. My Captain does not answer, his lips are pale and still." Although exasperated by Lincoln's assassination, the North was at the same time inspired by the grandeur of Grant's conduct at Appomattox. Nobody was hanged for a political crime, no land of the vanquished Confederates confiscated. "Since the Americans' most noble closing of the Civil War," wrote George Meredith, "I have looked to them as the hope of our civilization." The great man of the Civil War was Lincoln. Lacking him the North would have abandoned the contest. His love of country and abnegation of self made him a worthy leader. Other rulers of great power have remorselessly crushed those who stood in their way. He said, "I am not in favor of crushing anybody out. Give every man a chance." Lincoln is not as Mommsen wrote of Caesar, "the entire and perfect man, who worked and created as never any mortal did before or after him." Verily Caesar created Caesarism for the modern world, the autocracy of the Superman. But which is the better policy to transmit to mankind, despotism or liberty, the better injunction, "Submit yourselves unto Caesar," or "Give every man a chance"? In intellect Caesar and Lincoln are not to be compared. We speak of the mighty Caesar, never of the mighty Lincoln. But nobody speaks of honest Julius, while honest old Abe will live through the ages. CHAPTER XV. End of History of the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, by James Ford Rhodes. Recorded by Céline Major.